It's my delight this evening to introduce our speaker. Dr. Warren Kinghorn is a psychiatrist whose work centers on the role of religious communities in caring for persons with mental health problems and on ways in which Christians engage practices of modern healthcare. Jointly appointed with Duke Divinity School and the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences of Duke University Medical School, he is the co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative and is a staff psychiatrist at the Durham VA Medical Center. Dr. Kinghorn has his MD from Harvard University Medical School and his doctorate in theology from Duke University. In other words, he's gone to school for a really long time. And to steal a line from my kids, he's not only a Bible doctor, he's a real doctor. Warren has written on the moral and theological dimensions of combat trauma and moral injury, on the moral and political context of psychiatric diagnosis, and on the way that St. Thomas Aquinas' image of the human as wayfarer might inform contemporary practices of ministry and mental health care. This isn't hyperbole, what I'm about to say. I can't think of a better person to deliver tonight's talk. Now what? Facing anxiety in uncertain times. Join me in welcoming Dr. Warren Kinghorn.
Well, thank you, Josh. It is really good to be here in person. I've done a lot of Zoom things in the last year. I know you all have as well. And so to be in person, masks and all, is just an incredible treat. It's also, I'm amazed by the beauty of this space. And also I've so enjoyed connection with the New City Fellows for several years and with the Center for Public Christianity. And so it's really a pleasure to be here tonight. And thank you all for coming out tonight on a beautiful evening and for being here tonight to talk about this really important topic of anxiety. I do bring welcome from Duke and from the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke. Some of you are deeply connected to our work already, but if you want to know more about what we do, then on the table outside afterward, there's a flyer that lists some of our programs. We exist to connect the world of Christian faith and the world of healthcare and offer opportunities if you're a healthcare practitioner or a health profession student and you want to study in a seminary and connect your work in healthcare to Christian faith, then I'd love to talk with you more afterward. And I so appreciate, again, what the New City Fellows have done in the space of healthcare as well for years now. So we're here tonight to talk about anxiety, and I highly suspect that I am not the only one who has experience with the topic tonight, and not the only one who has wisdom to share. And I know all of you are just here and we're all settled in and comfortable now, but I just want to ask if over the past year, maybe over the past 18 months since the beginning of the pandemic, if you know someone who has struggled significantly with anxiety, if a loved one has struggled with anxiety, or if you yourself have struggled with anxiety, then could you stand? Yeah, thank you all. That's a lot of anxiety. I know that we feel that together. I feel it. I'm standing too, by the way. That's a lot of anxiety. And I think it's fair enough to say that we live right now in an age of anxiety. Even before the pandemic, I just want to give a few statistics and then I'll stop with the statistics, I promise. But even before the pandemic, the National Institute of Mental Health estimated that 1 in 5 US adults, that's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men, experienced an anxiety disorder. That's like generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety in any given year. And that nearly 1 in 3 of us will experience an anxiety disorder over the course of our lifetimes. Among adolescents, and I know some of you are adolescents or parents of adolescents here, the numbers are higher. So 32% of adolescents, that's 38% of girls and 26% of boys, experience an anxiety disorder in any given year. And I work on a college campus. Among college students, the numbers are pretty staggering. So in 2019, before the pandemic, 72% of college women 51% of college men said that they had felt overwhelming anxiety in the past 12 months, and these numbers actually have been trending up over the last decade. So about 30% higher in 2019 than they were in 2009. And in this spring of 2021, 30% of American college students said that they'd been formally diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Most of these had talked with a physician or healthcare practitioner about their anxiety in the past year. And 35.6%, 1 in 3 college students reported on a national survey that anxiety had negatively affected their academic performance in a class or delayed progress toward a degree. And of course, during COVID, the rates of anxiety have just increased dramatically. While the numbers vary survey to survey, and it's hard to get like real-time mental health data in a pandemic, but it's clear that higher numbers of people are endorsing feeling anxious on surveys and seeking mental health care or needing mental health care but not getting it. And I hope we'll be able to talk more in the Q&A about COVID specifically. I'll say a few things about it now and leave it for conversation later, but there's all sorts of kinds of stress and anxiety that you all are feeling, that I'm feeling. This is anxiety about getting sick with COVID, or loved ones, or anxiety about the symptoms of long COVID, or caregiving anxiety for those of you who are family members of those who've been sick, or those of you who are healthcare practitioners and are facing a burnout in hospital settings. There's anxiety of navigating COVID protocols, and those pastors with whom I work, health administrators with whom I work, people leading nonprofits are just exhausted because things are constantly changing and coming and going, and there's all sorts of questions. A lot of people are facing economic anxiety and housing anxiety, and then of course there's just the fact that our culture is incredibly divided right now. We have really frayed relationships. That causes anxiety. And then if the pandemic were not enough, it's also a time where over the last year there's been the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. There's been increased awareness of the realities of racism. We had an election. We had January the 6th. There's been attention to hurricanes and fires and climate change and so on. And all of that together, I think, is just easy to be in a place where it just feels like we just live in a world of anxiety. And so if you're anxious, you're not alone. But anxiety doesn't live in statistics. It lives in human beings and human experience. And so I'm here tonight to give both good and bad news. The bad news is that I don't stand before you tonight as someone who doesn't struggle with anxiety, or who has it all figured out, or who has a simple recipe for getting rid of anxiety. So if you came expecting that tonight, then I'm sorry. I'm not going to be able to give that to you. I myself feel anxious and have to think about what does it mean to manage my own anxiety. And I don't have like a quick set of answers. But the good news, and something that I'm willing to stake my life on, I'm willing to stake everything that I say tonight on, and that I think is something that we can hold on to, is that in a world full of anxiety, it makes all the difference to be held in the life of Jesus, in the heart of God. And that's what I want to focus on tonight. So I don't assume that everyone in here is Christian, and we all come from different traditions, but I want to invite you to pray with me tonight as we get started. I'll pray and follow along as you wish. Dear God, your word tells us to cast all of our cares upon the Lord because he cares for you. As we gather here tonight, full of anxiety and cares, we ask that your Spirit would be present here, and that through the Spirit, we may gain a glimpse of how deeply you care for us. Amen. So in the next few minutes, during my time up here at the podium, and then we'll sit and have question and answer, I want to kind of go through 3 main sections of this talk. And for those of you that like lists, you'll be happy, because I have like 3 sets of lists, basically, if you're taking notes. If you don't like lists, I'm sorry, but first, I want to give 4 affirmations of what it means to be human that I think are important for thinking about anxiety. And these are things that I kind of hang my hat on in thinking about mental health from a Christian perspective. I want to lay some groundwork. And then we'll move a little more specifically into 3 ways that anxiety shows up in our culture, 3 flavors or dimensions of anxiety. And then, at the end, I want to give 7 strategies for managing anxiety, dealing with anxiety, that are drawn from Christian faith. So that's where we're headed in the next few minutes. So first of all, 4 affirmations about being human that I think are relevant for thinking about mental health in general, and also relevant for thinking about anxiety. So the first affirmation, these are things that I think are, I'll try to talk about how they relate to anxiety, but I also just wanted to say, I think these are ways to think about who we are before God and before each other. And the first, and this is probably the most important thing that I'll say tonight, so if you don't remember anything else, remember this, that the deepest truth of who we are as human beings is that we are known and loved by God. And so anxiety can never constitute our identity. When you ask yourself, who am I? Like, what comes to mind? I know that when people ask me that, like, who are you? Or when I say, who am I often just kind of go to roles, like I'm a psychiatrist, or I'm a professor, or I'm a husband, or I'm a father. Or maybe that would be more other kinds of identity markers, like I'm a man, I'm white, I'm American, I'm a South Carolinian by birth, for example. But when God sees me, he doesn't actually see those things. He sees Warren Kinghorn, a creature, his good creature, whom he knows and he loves. And when he sees you all, he doesn't see like your roles or your titles or how you're valued by society. He sees you by your name as his creatures, unique people whom he knows and loves. Genesis 1, the creation story, ends with God looking over all that he had made, and it was very good. I think that's the verse to start on when we start thinking about mental health in Christian perspective. And I love the meditation on that verse by a Catholic philosopher named Joseph Pieper, who some of you may know of. Pieper was meditating on this, and he said, what does it mean for God to look at the creation and to say it is good? He says, in this case, love looks something like approval. Not approval for everything in the creation, for everything that someone does, but approval for the very fact of a creature's existence. Pieper said, for God to look at us and to say it is very good is to say, it's good that you exist. It's good that you're in this world. That is, I think, what we can hang our head on. When God looks at us, he says, it's good that you exist. It's good that you're in this world. And we can say that to each other, and we can even say that to ourselves. But God doesn't just love us, he knows us. And to listen to the first few verses of Psalm 139, Lord, you've searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. God knows us and loves us, and that is the deepest truth of who we are, not anything about us, including our anxiety. The second, I think, general principle is that we are creatures of earth who become who we are in relationship. And so anxiety is both a matter of our bodies and also of our relationships. So the book of Genesis teaches that we're dust, like we're made of carbon and oxygen and water and lots of other things that I learned about in medical school, and we're bodies. And so, people often get hung up. Is anxiety a physical thing? Is it a bodily thing? Is it a mental or spiritual? The answer is yes, it's all of those. But it starts in our bodies. Anxiety is a biological phenomenon. It involves not just our brains, but our muscles and our gut and our adrenal glands and certainly brain circuits, areas like the amygdala. This is where anxiety happens, when we feel anxiety. And as bodies, we're not just dust, and we're not just individual bodies, but we're bodies who come into relationship with other bodies. We're born from other bodies. We are always interacting with other bodies and with God and with the land around us. And so our experience, how we come into the world, how we find out who we are, is in relationship. And so anxiety doesn't just happen in our bodies, it also happens in our relationships and in our communities and in our culture. I think this leads to what psychiatrists sometimes call a biosocial model of human experience. that we're not just bodies. We're also not just like, freestanding ideas, but we're bodies who come into contact with other bodies, and our experience is always at the interface of our bodies and our relationships. And so when we're anxious, we can ask ourselves both, like, what's happening in my body right now, and how am I caring for my body? Is my body in danger? I also ask, like, what's happening in my relationships and in my community and in our culture that might be giving rise to anxiety? The third general principle is that we are wayfarers on a journey. And anxiety is just part of what it means to be on the way. The book of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 says, "Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with perseverance the race that is marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and forerunner of our faith." The Bible teaches that we are on a journey, and specifically, Christians believe that we're on a journey from God, our Creator and our source, to God, who is our end and our goal and our joy. And so all of our lives is lived as those who are on the way from God to God. And of course, on a journey, there's always going to be dangers and uncertainty. Anxiety is just part of what it means to be on the way. So on the way from Durham to Raleigh tonight, I got caught in a huge traffic jam on I-40, and I had pretty significant anxiety that I was not going to get here on time. And I felt like this, what I hadn't experienced much of the pandemic, which is a lot of traffic on I-40. And that's just part of what it means to be human. I was on the way and I had anxiety, and we are on the way. But the way that the image of the journey helps us is that the question is not like, how do I fix this, but what's needed right now for this journey? What's needed right now for us as we feel anxious on this journey from God to God? And we'll come back to this. And the fourth thing that I want to stress is kind of a general point, and this is maybe the most complex, and I want to be careful in how I say it, is that as humans, we're drawn to control. We like control. I like control. But we find our deepest fulfillment not in control, but in wonder and love. And I would argue in praise, glory of God. And so anxiety isn't just something to control, but it's something that can help us to love well. How can we be drawn from control to wonder? And I want to be careful about this because control is a good thing. So I work as a psychiatrist at the Durham VA. I work with a lot of veterans who are survivors of significant forms of trauma, combat trauma, sexual trauma, other forms of trauma. And trauma survivors will tell you, rightly, that control is really important. If you found the world uncontrollable and dangerous at a certain point, to have control over the basics of your bodily day-to-day existence, to find the place, to have agency, is really important. And that kind of safety is key to healing. And so control is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But control, if our lives become so focused on control of ourselves or our bodies or others' bodies or the world around us, then a couple of things can happen that I think maybe can get us off track. One is that if we seek control, we'll find ourselves giving a lot of power and a lot of our own allegiance to whomever or whatever we perceived has placed us in a position of control. So that might be achieving or hard work. I know something about this kind of way of seeking control in this way. It might be through relationships. It might be through exercise. It might be through lots of different things. But if we turn to something to put us in control, we're going to end up kind of giving power to that thing or that person or that system. And this is something that the Bible teaches us a lot about. The people of Israel understood much better than we do what it meant to be profoundly vulnerable and out of control. They were constantly finding themselves out of control. And just think about the things that we worry about in a global way or in a broader way in our culture. So, climate catastrophe, messed up politics, rising world powers and threat of war, internal divisions. It's all there. Read the Old Testament. It's all there. The people of Israel knew better than we do what it meant that in any year, their whole way of life could be upended and disrupted. And they also wanted control. They were constantly trying to kind of find ways to make the uncontrollable controllable. And so they would turn to the gods of their neighbors, who seemed to be a little more predictable than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and try to turn to those gods to bring control over the crops or over the weather or over their enemies. And God, the true God, was always saying, like, what are you doing? Like, I've always given you what you need when you need it. What are you doing turning to these other forms of control? So the desire for control can lead us to idolatry. The other thing with regard to mental health that can be a problem with control is that if our lives are really focused on control, then in mental health, it can often lead us to think that mental health is a matter of like controlling symptoms, that things happen in my body and they show up as symptoms and I just need to bring those symptoms under control. And that can lead us to think of the body as a kind of machine that needs to be fixed or things to be tweaked. And this is something that as a psychiatrist, I feel this in my own practice. But I think it's important as humans that sometimes it is helpful to think of the body as a kind of machine, but ultimately as humans, we're not machines that need to be fixed or recharged or refueled. Like, if we're machines, then that's all that would be needed. But we're living creatures who need to be held and tended and fed and cared for. We need to find ourselves drawn into love. And so how can we think about mental health in a way that foregrounds that we're not machines that need to be fixed, but we're living creatures who need to be able to love well? And I think that's how we can think about anxiety, that anxiety is not usually a sign of a broken machine, although it can arise from the body for reasons that have to do with how the body's working. But anxiety is often, I'd say usually in some way, a sign of love. Specifically, it's a sign that those whom we love or what we love, we're afraid of it being taken away or not present with us. So anxiety is a sign of our love. And in that way, anxiety can be a gift. It can be a really good thing because it can help us to order our loves. But if anxiety gets in the way of our loving ourselves or others or God well, then it can be a problem. So those are 4 general principles: that we're known and loved by God, we're creatures of earth who find ourselves in relationship, we're wayfarers on a journey, and we find our fulfillment not in control, although that's a good, but in love and wonder. So as I begin to kind of think more about anxiety in our last few minutes, I want to think about 3 ways that anxiety shows up in our culture. And I'm speaking to myself, and I suspect that many of you have felt these forms of anxiety also. So when psychiatrists often talk about forms of anxiety, we often turn to like diagnoses, like generalized anxiety or social anxiety, and I'm not going to do that. But I do want to say a few ways that I think that anxiety might have some different flavors, and these run together. I'm not trying to be comprehensive here, but I see this in my clinical practice, and I feel this in myself. And I want to mention 3 things, and for each of these things, I want to talk about a characteristic belief that can go along with this form of anxiety. And then also, as a Christian, I want to talk about how Christians can sometimes actually perpetuate this form of anxiety too. And then we're going to talk about how the gospel might respond to these forms of anxiety. So the first of these anxiety is anxiety related to fear. A lot of times people think that anxiety and fear are synonyms, but I don't think it's quite that easy. I think that anxiety can be broader than just fear. But this corresponds to a thought that may or may not be conscious. One doesn't have to be thinking this verbally or in your mind. But it corresponds to the belief that I am not safe and I will be harmed. Or it might mean my loved ones are not safe and they will be harmed. And in itself, like all anxiety, fear is actually a really good thing. Like if any of us today lost our capacity for fear, we would be in deep trouble as humans. We need our fear. So when I was, on I-40 tonight and feeling anxious about not getting here on time, I also needed to be aware of where the traffic was around me, and I attuned myself to these feelings of caution and fear to make sure I was looking and not getting in the way of another car. If I'm swimming in the ocean in the summer down at the beach and there's all of a sudden a huge thunderclap and a big bolt of lightning and I'm, waist deep in the ocean water, it's pretty good that I feel some fear to get out of the water. Like it helps motivate action. If I'm a college student and I realize that all of the people that drove to the party that I'm at are intoxicated, And fear is completely appropriate. It helps to motivate, like what does it mean to actually motivate us to different things? But all too often, this type of fear anxiety can get in the way for us. Our bodies tell us that we're in danger when maybe our minds know on some level that the danger is not that high. Or maybe there is elevated risk, but we're unable to move forward with something we need to do because of anxiety. And this, of course, is often associated with trauma. We know that the body remembers. People who've been in situations that are in which fear is completely appropriate and normal can find themselves caught in situations over and over again where there's this feeling of overwhelming fear and anxiety. And so, again, I work at the VA, so if there's a veteran who may have driven convoys in Iraq and experienced an explosion, and then is driving on I-40, I keep talking about I-40 in my talk tonight because it's fresh in my mind, driving on I-40, there's a piece of trash on the side of the road, then that person may swerve over 2 lanes and speed up because of that association. And fear lodges itself in our bodies. And I think that this, again, fear can be adaptive, but it can also sometimes get in the way. The question is, like, which is going on at any given time. But Christians can sometimes, I think, reinforce fear anxiety, not so much in these cases of trauma that I've described, but in general, when we embrace a kind of what I might consider a gospel of risk minimization. We think that any risk to our bodies or any danger is something that we need to avoid. And I think there's a real balance here, because we do need to promote safety, physical safety for ourselves and for others. We need to have communities of safety. But what does it mean not to make safety our very highest good, where we're ordering ourselves for maximum safety and security? Whether that's thinking about national security, whether that's thinking about who we're willing to associate with during the pandemic, whether that's thinking about the ways that we're engaged in our communities. And so I think that how do we think about managing our fear anxiety is a part of what I want to kind of think about how to discern. So the second form of anxiety is not so much related to fear, but related to shame. And this, my hypothesis is that along with anxiety related to fear, this is an incredibly common form of anxiety on, say, at Duke or on college campuses or in other, among young adults and adolescents. And this corresponds to the thought that I am not enough, or I am unworthy, or I'm somehow broken and dirty, and I will be abandoned and ostracized. And I know about this kind of anxiety because I feel it. I've also learned about it through the writings of people like Brene Brown and my friend Kurt Thompson, who's a Christian psychiatrist who has published a book called The Soul of Shame that I would recommend for anybody who's interested in exploring this in more detail. And he's got a new book that's just come out called The Soul of Desire. And I've learned from them and reading about and academic researchers on shame that shame, like fear, is one of the emotions that God has given to us. It's not intrinsically a terrible thing, but it's particularly powerful, and it can become easily toxic for us. It can really perpetuate anxiety. And shame correlates to a two-part belief, I believe. And the first part of the belief is that I am not blank enough. When the blank is whatever it is that is a marker of belonging or a marker of acceptance in a community that you really need or want to belong to. And so it might be in college settings, I'm not smart enough, or I'm not well-read enough, or I'm not athletic enough, or I'm not social enough, or I'm not good-looking enough, or whatever. In church settings, it might be I'm not orthodox enough, or I'm not progressive enough, or I'm not, conversational enough, or I'm not, all these kinds of things. And the second part of that belief is that when people recognize that I am not blank enough, then I'll be somehow ostracized from relationship. I'll be no longer welcome in this community, or at least I'll be treated in a different way. I won't fully belong. And that feeling, that fear that if we're just found out, that if people really knew who we really are, that we'll be cut off or not allowed to be in relationship, that naturally leads to a feeling of shame for us. And it has to do with, and shame adheres in who we are deeply, not just what we've done. And you think about what are the bodily expressions of shame? Well, it's downcast eyes, kind of hunker in on ourselves, expression folded in. It's a bodily posture that says, like, I'm not a threat and I'm just gonna back off and leave now. It separates us from other people. And shame, the toxic thing about shame is that it causes us to withdraw, which causes us to be more isolated, which actually makes it harder to develop the kinds of relationships that lead to its healing. And we deal with shame in all sorts of ways in our culture, but I believe that shame is something that most people would almost feel almost anything else rather than feeling shame. Men, I think especially, would rather feel anger than feel shame. People would sometimes rather feel, in lots of ways than to feel shame. And shame can cause us to do some things that actually are pretty unhealthy. It can cause us to just withdraw and to barricade ourselves and to not be a part of the communities that we want to be part of. It can cause us to blame ourselves and just to kind of punish ourselves. So at least if we agree with ourselves that we're not enough, then at least that everybody's clear about that. It can cause us to blame others and to split people apart from each other. It can cause us to do things to just numb our feelings. And I think a lot of substance use and alcohol use on college campuses, I think, and everywhere, is ways of managing shame by just trying to make it go away. Or, this is my personal favorite response to shame, we can compensate with shame by just trying really hard and striving and trying to convince other people that we're enough. And that can work pretty well, for quite a while. You can have a nice job, you can get a good education, until all of a sudden it just doesn't work anymore. And suddenly things start to fall apart. And sometimes the way that falls apart is by the sense of overwhelming anxiety. And Christians, I think, can contribute to and perpetuate this form of anxiety when we embrace a culture of achievement and competence that says, to be a good Christian is to be someone who has it together. And I know I've heard this as a kid growing up as a Christian, that, God has given you gifts, you better use them, you better do things that please God, you better do God's will, and that's the way to be in good with God, and you better not mess it up. And to me, that actually was pretty anxiety-producing, as think about what if I don't do that? What happens then if I'm somehow outside of God's will? So that's two forms of anxiety: fear anxiety and shame anxiety. And the third I would mention is what I consider anxiety related to the fear of deprivation, which corresponds to the belief that we or our loved ones, at some critical point in the future, will not have what we need, or that our loved ones won't have what they need. And this can cause us to buffer ourselves as much as we can against the possibility of not having what we need in the future. For those of us who are adults, this is things like padding our 401ks and having all the insurance policies that we need and building wealth. And this is, of course, healthy to a point. I have these things. But at some point, the desire to avoid future risk can actually get in the way of living well in the present and can start to be the point of life itself. And Jesus was especially critical of this in Luke 12 when he told the story of the man whose fields brought forth abundantly, and he thought to himself, what should I do? I had no place to store my crops, and so he built bigger barns and bigger storehouses, and he says, then I'll say, soul, you've ample goods laid up for many years, relax, eat, drink, and be merry. And Jesus says, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things that you've prepared, whose will they be? This always kind of eats at my heart, because I'm somebody who likes to save a lot and be cautious and be prudent on things. And there was a mid-20th century farmer and scholar and preacher named Clarence Jordan, who said, who looked at this verse and looked at the Greek, and he said, actually, this verse that's always translated, this very night your life will be demanding of you, what the Greek actually says is, they are demanding your soul of you. What's happening here? What is the they? It's all these barns, all these storehouses. This man lived as a servant of the very things that he thought would serve him. They are demanding your soul of you. And we might call this the kind of gospel of the bigger barns. Just need to buffer ourselves as much as possible. So if these are ways that anxiety shows up for us as Christians and in our culture, how might the gospel speak to a cure for anxiety? I just want to end with a few thoughts. I think the answer comes down to one thing mainly, and then I'm going to give several practical suggestions, but the main thing is this. God says to the people of Israel in the Old Testament, and Jesus says to his disciples and to us many times, do not be afraid. And it's so easy for me to hear that just to feel ashamed. Like, I'm afraid. I'm afraid. What about me? Am I just bad? And it triggers shame for me. But as I read this, Jesus is not trying to shame us or to browbeat us into thinking differently, as if you could just turn off anxiety just by just deciding to do so. Do not be afraid is a negative statement, but it's always in the context of a positive statement, which is perhaps best seen in Mark 6. There's a storm at sea. The disciples are terrified. They see Jesus walking on the waves, thinking he's a ghost. And Jesus said, do not be afraid, I am. Our translations say, it is I, but Jesus says, I am, which is as clear an example as you'll see in the Gospels of Jesus claiming divinity. I am God. I am capable of calming the storm. Give me an opportunity to hold you. And in the midst of our anxiety, whether it's fear or shame or deprivation anxiety or something else, I think we're called as Christians, and I feel challenged in this too, to take small steps not to barricade ourselves, not to hide, not to buffer ourselves, but to allow ourselves to be vulnerable before God and to give him a chance to hold us. So, very quickly, before we open it up for questions, I want to give 7 practical strategies for what it means to be able to deal with anxiety. And I speak as a psychiatrist and also as a Christian here. The first, and maybe the most important, is don't journey alone. Get help and seek the counsel of others. This talk, I'm so glad you all are here tonight, but this talk is not a replacement for therapy. Hopefully it might be a step into therapy. And I'd say that if you're feeling anxious and you're not sure how to manage that, seek the counsel of others, whether it's a pastor, whether it's a friend, a wise friend, whether someone whom you trust, or whether it's a therapist. And I think we all need this. And this is part of what it means to be on a journey. And there's very effective therapies for anxiety that we could talk about later. And I would say also part of that is that if you are in a position where you're unsafe, if you're in an unsafe relationship, if you are facing physical harm or emotional or spiritual harm right where you are, then your anxiety may be telling you something, that you need to be safe. And so that's an important thing. And of course, I always try to say in talks, if any part, your anxiety is making you think thoughts of I'd rather not be here, or I should be dead, or thoughts of suicide, then absolutely get help and seek care. And if you don't know where to turn, there's the National Suicide Crisis Line at 1-800-273-TALK, or the crisis text line at 741-741, and there's people who want to help you. It's critical. The second thing is to carry your anxiety to God. If you're afraid, as I often am, that God will judge you for your anxiety, and so you should hide it from him, then I think just look at Scripture. Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul, have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? And the psalmist goes on, the Psalms give us the language to carry our anxiety to God. It's right there in Scripture. Therefore, it's right there as a gift to us to be able to lean into. There's nothing that you can carry to God that God does not know, nothing that you can carry to him that will change or affect his love for you. Nothing in all creation. Third is to inhabit the day and place where we are. A lot of anxiety has to do with time, feeling we don't have enough time or time is not on our side. And I think that this speaks to something that's deeply disordered about our world, which is that the way that we inhabit time and place. I might call this clock time. I just read this really fascinating review in the New York Review of Books about a book on the history of clocks. And this review makes the point that clocks are a moral invention that have to do with moral control. People invented clocks like Big Ben or different clocks, the Roman sundials, in order to bring people under control. And now we have these highly precise clocks that are actually more precise than even the movement of the earth and the moon. So every now and then we have to recalibrate our clocks to like match up. Like we've made ourselves highly regimented. But God, I would argue, God didn't like intend for us to inhabit time in that kind of highly regimented way. What God created for us is the day to inhabit. He created place for us to inhabit. And how can we focus on right where we are? Not to think about all of time, but to think about the day where we are. How can we inhabit the day well? To notice the day and the place in front of us, rather than to be focused on what might happen at some point in the future. So how can we do this? One, I think, is to be aware of the problems of the world. I'm not calling anybody to like be ignorant of the things that we've been talking about, but also to not let that so dominate our attention that we can't actually focus on what's right in front of us, on the beauty all around us here tonight of each other, on the beauty of this time of the year, on the people that God has given us right in front of us. And that might mean practical things like limiting social media, limiting the amount of time that we spend watching TV, limiting the amount of time that we allow our attention to be focused outside of what's immediately in front of us. And it's taking the time and space to notice our bodies and the world around us, to see, to dwell, to breathe, to attend to beauty. And I think this is what Jesus was getting at in Matthew 6, where he's saying, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow or reap or stow away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? He keeps going on, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his glory was clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you? It's that practice of attending to what's right in front of us. Next is to care for your body with the dignity that it deserves as God's good creature. Whether or not anxiety only stems from our bodies, anxiety happens in our bodies, and caring well for our bodies is important. Sleep and exercise and diet are really important. And then avoiding substances or distractions that harm. And I would say part of caring for our bodies, in the context of seeking the care of others, may well be taking medication for anxiety. I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A, but that can be a part of how we care for our bodies and what it means to be on the journey. Sometimes what's needed for the journey is a medication. Next is seek healthy connection with others. One, I think, of the deepest costs of the pandemic is that it's kept us from experiencing many of the everyday, ordinary, seemingly effortless connections that we have with other people. To eat together, to feast together, to laugh together. And I think we miss that. We may not even realize even now how much we miss that. We have missed that, and the cost of that. But as humans, we're called into relationship. That's how beauty and grace comes to us so often. So as we are beginning to emerge from the pandemic, what does it mean to seek connection with others? Next to last is to commit yourself to a purpose that's greater, that brings you, that draws you into beauty. For those of you that are already, overcommitted with care of various sorts, this may not be the advice for you. But for those of you that are feeling it's hard to kind of escape a prison of anxiety, what does it mean? What might be your vocation to pursue something of beauty, to serve someone else, to be part of something that helps to draw you out of that into vocation? And then the last thing I would say is to practice, and this is I'm saying this to myself, and this is kind of something that I think is called to us, but it's hard for me to do too, which is to practice trusting God to hold you. The core of anxiety, of dealing with anxiety, is not to try to just repress it, or to numb it, or to deny it, or just to pretend that by force of will we can just change it away. But the core of anxiety is taking small steps to step into those situations that we might feel anxious about. And I think as Christians we can do this with confidence that God can hold us. Sometimes God may call us into big things that cause a lot of anxiety, but I think the challenge for us might be, what would it mean to take small steps? Maybe to, if we're feeling anxiety about the future, maybe to give a little bit more of our income away. Whether it might be to associate with somebody that might be afraid of or afraid with. Whether it might be to be vulnerable when we're feeling ashamed on the possibility that we might be vulnerable and be met not with judgment and ostracism, but with love of God and love of others. That's how we can come through our anxiety. And I think there's a verse of the song, There's a Hope by Stuart Townend, that I just think is lovely. And I always kind of come to this, and I think it's really helpful. And I'm going to try to sing it. There is a hope that lifts my weary head, consolation strong against despair, that when the world has plunged me in its deepest pit, I find the Savior there. Through present sufferings, future's fear, he whispers courage in my ear, for I am safe in everlasting arms, and they will lead me home. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I really am grateful to a chance to be here.
Warren, thanks for your talk. That was wonderful, and I didn't know you could sing. It was great.
That's a judgment call for the audience.
I was feeling bad. I loved your watch analogy. But I was feeling bad that I gave you a time limit, and kind of gave you at that point. So we've had lots of questions come in, and I just want to jump straight to them. I had some prepared for you, but I'm not going to use those. I'm just going to use what's coming in from the audience. How do you respond to people who don't believe that mental health is a real issue and believe that all one needs to do is pray it away?
Well, I think one thing I would say is to read the Bible, because if you look at the Psalms of Lament, all of the experiences that I hear from my patients at the VA when they come in for mental health care are present in the experience of the biblical authors. There's this text in Jeremiah 4 that I think of as somebody who works with veterans, where I can't quote it off the top of my head, but it's like, my anguish, the walls of my heart are beating wildly, for I hear the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. I'm like, I don't know if Jeremiah, when he wrote that, had experienced combat, but he certainly sounds like somebody who knew something about that experience, what it means to have these memories come back to you. And so I think one is that just the experiences of the biblical authors should, I think, keep us from thinking in any simplistic way about mental health. And I think, listen, I'm a Christian. I hope that's clear by now. I believe prayer can be helpful. I believe that prayer in the context of mental health challenges can be helpful. But it comes down to the question of what's needed right now for the journey. And I think what's needed is often prayer. I think it's great for us to pray for each other and with each other when we're struggling. But often much more than prayer is needed. The wisdom of a good counselor is needed. Often, I think medication is needed. Sometimes other things like hospitalization is needed. And I think that that's where the wisdom of mental health clinicians can really be important.
You mentioned lament, and you mentioned the Psalms quite a bit. And in some of our traditions, well, in a lot of our just evangelical traditions, that sometimes is downplayed in our worship. It's about being exciting. It's, we want to be upbeat. And yet, it seems that the Psalms are rather more diverse. Could you speak a little bit more to that, and maybe how the church has not used all our resources that we have here?
Absolutely. So we're here in this beautiful Anglican church. Those of you that attend here have the daily office. I mean, Anglicans are pretty good at dwelling in the Psalms, but I think that this is not just for Anglicans or Catholics or whoever. The Psalms are given to all of us, and they are diverse. And one of the things that's really changed my life was learning more about the Psalms of Lament, as well as other laments like that in the book of Job and Jeremiah and Lamentations. And there's a few things that happen in the Psalms of Lament, and I think Psalm 13 that I read a bit of in the talk was a really good example of this. So first of all, the psalmist addresses God. They're prayers to God, and they're taking our experiences directly to God. And the psalmist often talks in very raw language about his experience. Like, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Psalm 22. How long will you forget me forever? Like, there's these honest prayers to God. The psalmist is like holding back nothing, bringing the depths of his anxiety and fear and despair straight to God. And often the psalmist will even say, God, you're faithful, so why are you not showing up, like right here, right now? And it's almost like, oh, it's right there in Scripture. It's given to us to pray. And then often what is the case, not in every lament psalm, but in most of them, is, and this is the case at the end of Psalm 13 also, is that after this like raw prayer of just bringing these things before God, there's a confession of God's goodness. That doesn't mean that God has answered everything. So in the case of Psalm 13, verses 5 and 6, after saying, all these things are happening, my enemies are after me, I'm going to die, the psalmist says, but I trusted in your, I trusted in your unfailing love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me. And I love the way that the tenses are changed in those last couple of verses, because the psalmist never gets an answer to his prayer right then. God still hasn't shown up at the end of the psalm. But the psalmist is able to say, I recognize your goodness to the people of Israel. I know that you led us out of Egypt. I know that we're people of the covenant. I know that you're a God who keeps your covenant. And so I will trust in your hesed, your unfailing love to me right now. And that's sometimes what we need in the midst of anxiety. It's not expecting immediate results, but it's to be able to say, I can carry my anxiety to a God who will be there and who I can trust God's goodness even when I can't see it right now. And that's part of what I think it means to the challenge of living in faith.
Thanks. We've got a range of different kinds of we're going to go theological and practical. We're just going to, you've got multiple degrees, so we're counting on you. This one's maybe more straightforward, which is if somebody's saying, okay, yeah, I probably need to see a counselor, but I'm looking for a Christian, a biblical counselor, what would be the next steps for them?
Yeah, thank you. I realize we have a diverse group here tonight from not only different areas of North Carolina, but also different faith traditions. And what I would say is, first of all, if you're thinking, maybe I should seek help, that is almost certainly a clear indication that it's a good idea. So if you're thinking about it, do it, and you will not regret it. And I think that that's really important. And so if you're kind of on the edge, do so. I think I'm happy to talk afterward about individual questions that some of you may have. And I didn't come tonight to make specific recommendations, but what I would say is that if you're a Christian and you're involved in a church or a faith community, then a lot of pastors have a network of people that they know of in the area who they've referred people to before and they've heard feedback from. And so I would just ask a pastor, who would you recommend if I wanted to talk to somebody about anxiety or whatever it is? And that's often a way to get connected with somebody well. And during COVID, a lot of therapists around here are pretty booked and so may not have availability. But often therapists will usually have a phone call with you and say, let me understand what's going on. And they might say, well, I actually don't have a space in my schedule right now. I can't make it. But I have a colleague who actually would be a really good fit for what you're describing. And so it may take a little bit of searching and maybe even visits with a couple of people, but I think you'll find somebody that can be really helpful. And there's a lot of really great Christian therapists in this area and a few Christian psychiatrists. And so I think this is the area where we do have plenty of resources, including, I'm sure, some of you in the room.
Thank you. How can you prevent emotionally straining work from affecting life outside of work?
That's a good question to me as well. Yeah. First of all, I think that a lot of us have different experiences of emotional strain at work, and I think that's really important. And I don't know if I have any profound theological answer here, but I do think that, I'll just say, I won't give any examples, but I'll just say I was speaking with a colleague earlier today, and this colleague was incredibly frustrated because she had a patient who she was trying to care for. The patient needed things that the system was just not providing, and my colleague felt very responsible for making it happen. And it was just leading to this intense sense of frustration. And so we just talked about the fact that unfortunately, like, we can only do what we can do. Like in this case, you have a certain role with this person. You're trying to help in a certain way. You have a certain amount of time and certain ways that you can intervene, and that's what you can do. And trying to be honest about that is a way then to think like, well, what then is necessary in the future? So I think one is just to not let the imperfections of our systems and the strain of our work to internalize that as if like it all relies on us. And that I think can help to just be able to say, I'm gonna be at work, I'm gonna do everything that I can do within the limits of what God has given me. But then in order to make that sustainable, I have to be able to leave it. And I have to be able to rest. And I have to be able to take Sabbath. And I have to be able to spend time with family. And I have to be able to exercise and to sleep, which is a challenge for me, and to eat well and to care for myself. This is not selfish to do this. This is part of what it means to be committed to a lifetime of vocation. And so these are, I don't know saying much that you haven't heard before, but I think I would just say, what does it mean to be honest about our own finitude and limitation, and to be able to rest in that?
Does God give us anxiety?
I believe, and you mentioned in your introduction that St. Thomas Aquinas is a go-to person for me. I believe yes. And I think that's a caveat because anxiety covers a lot of different things. But if by anxiety we mean the emotions of fear and shame too that I mentioned tonight, I do think that God gives us that. I think that's part of what it means to be humans. And if I tonight were to lose my capacity for fear and shame, you wouldn't want to be associated with me. Like, I'd be doing reckless things and I'd be treating people incredibly poorly. I think these are like the point of emotions is not to like eradicate them or to keep some and not others, but it's for all of our emotions to be oriented in the service of love. And so for me to have, so it's not a question of like if I fear or if it's okay or not to fear, but it's what do I fear? Whom do I fear? When do I fear? And what do I do when I feel fear? And same with shame, even more. What do I do with my shame? Does it keep me from love of others and of God, or does it actually serve as a kind of signpost that can help point me into a space of love? And so, yes, I do think that God gives us anxiety. I think that there are ways in which our anxiety can become that we can get off track, where we can be so focused, for instance, on control that we end up feeling anxiety because of that. But I think the emotions themselves, yes, are part of God's gift to us.
Let me ask a follow-up, because multiple people have kind of asked similar things, and another person's question is getting at this. So when you say we're given anxiety, how would you nuance that with the fall, pre-fall, new heavens and new earth, and the storyline? That's basically what somebody was kind of getting at there too.
Well, first of all, we don't. If I were to say that I understood exactly what was going on in Adam and Eve's psychology before the fall, like I would be guessing on a lot of things. We just don't have that kind of certainty from what the Scripture tells us. But I think that we can say if we are willing to say that before the fall, sin had not yet entered the world and sin had not yet entered human experience, then I think it pushes the question of, like, in a pre-fall state without sin, would Adam and Eve have possibly felt anxiety? And I would argue, yes, because it's part of what God has given to us, and that if they had known not to eat of the tree in the middle of the garden and had reached for it, something might have said, maybe you shouldn't do that because God has said not to do that. It might get in your way in some way. And that would, they would not have sinned, and anxiety would actually be protecting them against sin. I think where anxiety gets in the way, and this is something that Kurt Thompson writes about in The Soul of Shame, and what I think is a minority interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3, and so I want to respect there's different ways of interpreting the Scripture, but one way to think about the what's happening in Scripture is that the serpent comes and says to Adam and Eve, like, you can be like God, you won't die. And I've read several people that have said the serpent's kind of acting like a groomer in some ways, like a tempter. Adam and Eve were, St. Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century believed Adam and Eve were like children. They didn't know what it meant to die. And they were reaching for what they thought would be good, to be like God. And in that moment, in that first sin, when they were deceived and tricked, then shame entered the world, entered their experience, drove them away from God. And so then when God comes looking for them in the garden, they're hiding. And they've covered the most sensitive parts of their body with these nettle-like fig leaves that are punishing themselves and keeping them away from God. And then shame then gives rise to further sin, and sin gives rise to further shame. And that's one way to read those texts. I don't want to say that that's the only way that those texts are read in Christian tradition, but it's one way to think about how, with the introduction of sin, our emotions can become ordered wrongly in ways that then lead us into like self-defeating cycles of sin and shame and other things. What I want to avoid though is to identify any emotion with sin itself, as if like to feel this way is to be sinful, because I think it's much more complex than that. And I think that our emotions are given to us by God. It's always a question of like what's happening at any given time with how our emotions are working, and it's never something that we should feel ashamed just for feeling a certain thing.
Thanks. I'm just glad I'm asking you the questions and not having to answer them. But this is kind of a taste of the conversations we have in Fellows as we're...
Yeah.
So, but I don't have to do it in front of 200 people. I just answer them in front of 15. So it's, yeah. So I'm glad I'm asking. Talk about how Christians, or as a Christian, you think about the resources you gave us tonight and the topic of medication and anxiety.
Yeah. So thanks for asking about medication. I'm a psychiatrist. I prescribe medications a lot. And it's one of the people often come to me specifically because they want medication. And to me, the question of medication, first of all, I think that medications can be profoundly helpful for anxiety. But it comes back to the question that I mentioned in the middle of the talk, that if we understand ourselves as wayfarers from God to God, that we're on a journey, the key question that helps us make sense of anything regarding what we're to do is what's needed right now for the journey. And that can be a lot of different things. It could be what's needed is a community. It could be what's needed is an experience. It could be what's needed is a safe place to live. It could be what's needed is to get out of an abusive relationship. It could be what's needed is ability to confess something about which one feels deeply guilty and ashamed. It may be a lot of things, but it may well be a structured course of psychotherapy, and it may well be a medication. There's different kinds of medications for anxiety. Some medications that often feel like they help the quickest, like the benzodiazepines, are complex because they can help attenuate feelings of anxiety, but they actually get in the way of the progress in therapy for anxiety, and that's partly how they work in the brain. And so the medications are not an unmitigated good, but people may need to take benzodiazepines for a certain time and for certain conditions like panic disorder. Other medications like the serotonin-active medications, like fluoxetine and paroxetine and sertraline, are kind of first line for use in anxiety, and they don't change like who you are. They don't get in the way of therapy like the benzodiazepines do, but they do kind of take some of the peaks and valleys out of experiences of anxiety. And so I often, when I'm talking to my patients, often use the language, and I'm not working in a specifically Christian context, so this is not usually a specifically theological conversation, but I'll use the language of starting line and finish line. That medications aren't usually going to get you to the finish line, which is where you want to be with your anxiety, but they can get you to the starting line where you can then do the work of engaging in therapy. And so if someone is so anxious that they are unable to manage their daily affairs, or unable to go to school, or unable to even begin to think about doing the work of exposure in therapy, then medications can be really helpful in helping people get to that point. So I think medications are given by God. I think they can be used in really wonderful ways, but they are almost never the only solution. I would argue that they probably shouldn't be in most cases the first option, although if they are, what I mean by that is first option without anything else on the table. So I think most people can benefit both from talking to someone in therapy and also from medication, rather than only thinking about managing anxiety with medication. Although these are complicated questions, and I recognize that in some cases, and in some cases, the patients that I treat, medication may be the only thing that's available. A person may live 2 hours away and not have access to therapy, not be able to do it for some reason, and so medication is what we go with. And I celebrate its availability.
Thank you. I'm so glad somebody asked this question. What's the best way to support someone who's experiencing anxiety, especially in the moment of an acute anxiety attack?
Yeah. Many of you I know probably experience panic disorder, where you have panic attacks, and where you have had close proximity to people who are having acute anxiety attacks, and it's terrifying. It's terrifying to go through them, and it's terrifying to attend someone going through them, because people feel everything in our body is sending signals of danger, like including I'm going to die right now, and there's an acute feeling of terror. And I think that in acute anxiety attacks, or even maybe when we think about folks who are just chronically so anxious, I think personal presence can go a long way. What you don't want to say is just snap out of it. You don't want to say, God is good, so you shouldn't feel this way, because that just intensifies anxiety and shame and other things. What you can say is, I'm right here. I'm right here with you, and I'm not going away. Or you can say, I want you, if possible, you don't want to ever tell somebody how they should feel in those situations, but you can say, I just invite you. I'm just sitting right here in front of you, and I just wonder if right here and now, I'm just going to breathe deeply. And if you feel like you can, if you could begin to do so with me. Again, you don't want to pressure somebody, but just that personal presence, that attentiveness to let people know that they're not alone. With panic attacks specifically, it's going to pass. They're going to get through it, but it doesn't feel like that in the moment. And so having someone to carry us through those times is really, really important. And then to get professional help to know, so the person can begin to learn, when I begin to feel these triggers, what do I do to manage these experiences?
Last question, or I want to give you an opportunity to expand on this a little bit. You said in your talk, anxiety is a sign of love. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
We are created to be lovers, to be drawn in love to God, to be drawn in love to others. For us to be lovers is to then feel united to those whom we love, whether that's my wife, whether that's God, whether that's my children, whether that's those who are my immediate circle that I care about. We love in different ways according to different relationships. But when we perceive that either we ourselves or someone whom we love is in danger, then anxiety is a natural feeling. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and she's now in high school in person for the first time and beginning to do, things that high schoolers do. And I'm recognizing that it's really soon that she's going to be less and less even in our house, when she goes off to college. And what does it mean for me to recognize I might not know where she is. She might be in danger. And anxiety is a natural sign, I think, for her. It's a sign of what does it mean for me to love her? And I think as a parent, it's how do I not let that anxiety get in the way of her being able to develop and grow and mature as a human being. But I think the anxiety itself, the feeling what we feel when we feel that someone close to us or we ourselves are in danger, is not just something to get rid of, but it's a sign of love. And so we can always ask ourselves when we're feeling anxious, what does this say? What can I learn from this about my love? The caveat there is that there are times, I believe this to be true, when, and there's specific medical conditions that this can be the case with, and there's also things that we don't understand about how the brain functions. Sometimes I do believe that anxiety can just happen as a part of what's happening in the body. It's not related to relationships or other things. It can just happen. And in that case, I think it requires a different approach. But I would argue that most of the time, and when we think about the anxiety in our culture, and when we think about how we experience anxiety, it's not disconnected from our loves.
Warren, thanks so much. We are grateful. You've been a gift tonight. Please show your support for Warren. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all so much.